The first thing I noticed when I walked into my sister-in-law's wedding reception was the smell. Gardenias. The florist had gone overboard with them. White clusters crowded every table. And underneath that, something sharper. Someone's perfume. Heavy. The kind that announces itself before the person wearing it even enters the room. I remember thinking, odd choice for a June wedding. I didn't know yet that the perfume would matter. My name is Cassidy. I'm 31 years old. I'm a senior partner at an architectural firm in Chicago, which means I spend most of my days deciding which walls are load-bearing and which ones can come down. I've gotten pretty good at reading structures, knowing what's holding something up and what's just decorative. I wish I'd been better at reading my own marriage. My husband. I'll call him my husband because that's what he was for 6 years, and names don't really matter anymore. Was a project manager at a mid-sized construction company. He made $64,000 a year. I made $412,000. We both knew this. We never talked about it the way other couples probably should have. I thought that meant we were past it. I understand now that he had just buried it somewhere quiet and let it rot. He was my sister-in-law Philippa's older brother. That's how we met, at their parents' anniversary dinner 8 years ago. The one where his mother made a toast and cried, and he leaned over to me and whispered, "She cries at everything, even grocery store commercials." And I laughed so hard I knocked over my water glass. I thought, this is the kind of man I want. Warm, funny, a little self-deprecating. I wasn't wrong about who he was then. I think I was just wrong about who he became. The wedding was in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, a vineyard venue. Philippa had planned it for 2 years. Mood boards, vendor spreadsheets, and a color palette she called Dusty Rose and Champagne. She'd asked me to be one of her witnesses. I'd said yes immediately because Philippa is one of those rare people who makes you feel like the most important person in the room whenever she talks to you. I loved her. I still do. I wore a dress the color of pale sage. I'd had it tailored. My hair was up. I remember feeling genuinely happy driving out there. Windows down, playlist on, my husband in the passenger seat scrolling his phone. He was quieter than usual on the drive. I asked twice if he was okay. He said, yes, fine, just tired. I didn't push. The ceremony was at 4 in the afternoon, under an arch of eucalyptus and white roses. I stood with the wedding party and watched Philippa walk toward her husband-to-be, and I felt that specific kind of joy that sits right up against your throat. Almost tears, but not quite. My husband was seated in the 3rd row. When I glanced back at him, he was looking at his phone. Dinner was at 6:30 in the barrel room. Long wooden tables, candlelight, the kind of venue that makes everything look like a painting. I found my place card, set down my clutch, and turned to find my husband. He was standing near the entrance, talking to someone. I noticed the perfume before I recognized her. She was around my age, maybe a year or 2 younger. Dark hair, a red dress at a Dusty Rose and Champagne wedding, which should have been my first clue. She was laughing at something my husband had said, one hand resting on his arm just below the elbow. A light touch, familiar, the kind you don't do with someone you've just met. My mother-in-law appeared at my elbow. "Cassidy," she said. She said my name like it was a mild inconvenience. She'd always said it that way. "I want to introduce someone. She's an old friend of the family, very dear to us." I looked at my mother-in-law. I looked at the woman in the red dress. Something shifted in my chest. Not a crack, more like when a building settles, that deep structural groan you feel before you hear it. "She'll be sitting at the family table," my mother-in-law said. "I hope you understand. We have so many people tonight, and seating was simply—" "Where am I sitting?" I asked. She pointed to a table near the back. "Table 11, by the kitchen doors." For a moment, I just stood there. I was the one who had wired $30,000 into Philippa's wedding fund when her original venue fell through. I was the one who drove their mother to chemotherapy appointments for 4 months the year before. I was the one who spent every Christmas morning in that family's house for 6 years, who knew their cousins' names, who remembered their grandmother's birthday. And I was being placed at table 11 by the kitchen doors, while a woman in a red dress I had never seen in my life was being seated with the family. My husband finally walked over. "Hey," he said. He didn't quite meet my eyes. "You found your seat?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I did," I said. I picked up my clutch. I found Philippa in the bridal suite upstairs, still getting her veil adjusted. When she saw my face, she sent her bridesmaids out of the room immediately. She didn't even have to ask me what was wrong, which told me she already knew something was happening, had maybe known for a while. "Tell me what's going on," I said. She told me his name, the woman's involvement, how long it had been. At least 14 months, according to Philippa, who had found out 3 months ago and had been watching it destroy her from the inside, while trying to figure out how to tell me without wrecking her own wedding in the process. She was crying by the end. I wasn't, which surprised me. I hugged her. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. Then I went back downstairs, walked to the family table, picked up the gift I had brought, an envelope containing a check for $10,000 and a handwritten card, and tucked it under my arm. I did not make a scene. I did not walk over to my husband. I did not look at the woman in the red dress. I walked to the venue coordinator, handed her the envelope, and asked her to make sure Philippa received it personally after the reception. Then I walked out to the parking lot, got in my car, and drove the 2 hours back to Chicago alone. My husband called 11 times before I reached the interstate. I let them all go to voicemail. Somewhere around Kenosha, I turned my phone completely off and drove the rest of the way in silence. The windows were still down. The playlist was still on. I turned the music off too, eventually, and just listened to the road. When I got home, I walked through our apartment, the apartment I had bought, the one in my name, and I looked at it the way I look at a building when a client asks me to assess it. What's structural? What's decorative? What can come down? I called my attorney the next morning. What followed was not clean or quick. Nothing about this was a movie. There was no single conversation that resolved it. No confrontation where he crumbled and confessed and I delivered the perfect line. What there was, 6 weeks of mediation, a great deal of paperwork, and the particular exhaustion of having to list line by line the financial contributions you have made to someone else's life. My attorney, I'd worked with her before on contract disputes, and she is precisely as sharp as she needs to be. Walked into that first mediation and placed a document on the table. A full accounting. 6 years of joint expenses broken down by contributor. The apartment mortgage, the car he drove, the vacation to Portugal, the kitchen renovation he'd wanted. My contributions, 83%. His, 17%. He hadn't known she was going to do that. The color left his face. I didn't enjoy watching it. I want to be honest about that. I had loved this person. Some part of me, some stubborn and stupid part, was still grieving something, even as I sat across that table. But I had also spent 6 years making myself smaller in places I didn't even notice, worrying that my success made him feel diminished, being careful never to talk about certain things, editing myself. I was done editing. The divorce was finalized 5 months later. I kept the apartment. He moved in with his mother. The woman in the red dress, according to Philippa, was gone within 6 weeks of the wedding. Apparently, she'd believed there was more on offer than there turned out to be. My mother-in-law sent me a text 2 months after the papers were signed. It said, "I always thought you were cold. I hope you know what you gave up." I read it once. I didn't respond. What I want to tell you is the part that happened 18 months later, because I think it matters. I was in Denver for a project, a mixed-use development downtown, one of the biggest contracts my firm had ever taken on. 4 days of site visits and client meetings, My colleague Theo had booked us a table at a restaurant near the hotel for the last night. And when we arrived, there was already someone at the bar who we apparently knew from a conference years ago. He waved him over. His name was Joel. He was a structural engineer. He had very calm hands, and he talked about bridge load distribution the way some people talk about things they actually love. We ended up talking for 3 hours, while Theo very obviously and very graciously pretended to be absorbed in his steak. Joel asked for my number. I said yes. I want to be clear that this was not the resolution. This was not the part where a new man fixes what the old one broke. That's not how any of this works. And I want to see that clearly because I spent a long time believing I needed someone else's approval to feel like what happened to me wasn't my fault. I don't. You don't. But Joel is kind, in a way that is not complicated. He doesn't make me feel like my success is something to be apologized for. When I talk about a project, he asks questions, real ones. Last month, he drove 4 hours to see the building I just completed because he wanted to stand in front of it. We've been together 9 months. I haven't introduced him to my family yet. I'm taking my time. I've earned the right to take my time. What I think about now when I think about that evening, and I still do sometimes, usually in the car for some reason, is not the woman in the red dress or my mother-in-law or even my husband's face in that mediation room. I think about the parking lot. That 2-minute walk from the venue door to my car, the gravel under my heels, the sound of the reception starting up behind me, the first notes of the band's opening song floating out across the vineyard, someone laughing, glasses clinking. I remember thinking I could go back in. I could sit at table 11. I could smile through the whole thing and drive home with him tonight and pretend I don't know and deal with it next week. I had done exactly that before. Not this specific thing, but other versions of it. Said yes when I meant no. Stayed when I should have moved. Made myself fit into a shape I hadn't chosen. The gravel crunched under my shoes. I kept walking. My sister-in-law Philippa had her first baby 7 months ago. A girl, 8 pounds 4 ounces, dark hair, already very opinionated about sleeping schedules. I was in the delivery waiting room when the nurse came out and said everything was fine and healthy. I started crying in a way I hadn't in years. Good crying, the kind that cleans something out. Philippa named her Cassidy. Her husband looked a little uncertain about this, which I understand. But Philippa just held that baby and looked at me over her husband's shoulder and said, "It had nothing to do with my husband, or his mother, or the woman in the red dress. Philippa had done nothing wrong. Philippa had, in fact, tried to protect me in the only way she knew how, given the circumstances she was in. Leaving her that check was not generosity, in spite of what happened. It was generosity because of what happened. Because she deserved it. Because what her mother and brother did that night was not her fault. I've never regretted it. What I regret is the years I spent convincing myself that peace in a relationship was the same thing as being happy. That keeping things quiet was the same as keeping things good. That choosing not to see something clearly was somehow a kindness to myself. It wasn't. Peace isn't the same as good. Quiet isn't the same as safe. I know the difference now. And that, if I'm honest, is the only thing I walked away from that vineyard parking lot carrying that actually mattered. Everything else I left behind. I thought a lot about what causes a life to go the way it goes. Not fate, not luck. I don't really believe in either of those as explanations. What I believe in is accumulation. Every choice you make and every choice you don't make stacks up over time into something you eventually have to live inside of. My husband made choices for 14 months that he thought had no cost. That's the thing about deception. It gives you the temporary sensation of getting away with something. And for a while, he did. I didn't see it. Or maybe some part of me saw the edges of it and chose not to look directly at the center. which is its own kind of choice. The night I drove home from that vineyard alone, I kept turning over the same question. How did I get here? And the honest answer wasn't comfortable. I had spent 6 years in a marriage where I quietly absorbed the discomfort of being more successful than my husband because I didn't want him to feel small. I made myself smaller, to fit. I stopped mentioning certain projects. I changed the way I talked about work. I thought I was being kind. I understand now that I was being dishonest. With him, yes, but mostly with myself. That's the part people don't say out loud enough. When you tolerate being diminished, you're not just accepting something. You're teaching the other person that diminishing you is acceptable. I taught that lesson for 6 years without meaning to.